There is a house in Pennsylvania that has been rotting for over 50 years. Its marble floors are buried under decades of debris. Its ballroom ceiling, once painted with scenes of gods and angels, has been collapsing piece by piece since the 1980s, each falling slab destroying a work of art that can never be replaced. The iron gates at its entrance are still standing. They were built to keep the world out. Now, in a bitter reversal, they keep the ruin in. This is Linwood Hall, and it is just one of hundreds. Across the United States, behind overgrown hedgerows and rusted fences, behind no trespassing signs that nature is slowly swallowing whole, there are mansions, dozens of rooms, miles of hardwood floors, libraries that once held thousands of books, stables bigger than most modern homes, kitchens with enough copper pots to feed a small army, ballrooms where American presidents once danced. They are empty now. They have been empty for decades. And most Americans drive past them every single day without knowing they exist. This is the story of how some of the greatest private homes ever built in the history of the United States came to be forgotten. It is a story about money, obscene amounts of it, and what happens when that money disappears. It is a story about ambition and grief and the very particular American delusion that wealth, once achieved, is permanent. It is about the families who built these places, the families who lost them, and the curious, obsessive, sometimes dangerous people who have spent their lives trying to document them before they are gone forever. But more than anything else, this is a story about time. About what time does to beautiful things when no one is left to care for them. And it begins, as so many American stories do, with a period of almost incomprehensible excess. Between roughly 1870 and 1929, a small group of American industrialists accumulated wealth on a scale that had never been seen before in human history. These were the men who built the railroads and the oil pipelines and the steel mills and the telegraph networks that transformed the United States from an agricultural backwater into the most powerful industrial economy on Earth. Their names are still familiar: Carnegie, Vanderbilt, Rockefeller, Frick, Astor, Mellon, DuPont. But there were hundreds of others, men who made fortunes in coal and copper and shipping and banking, whose names have faded almost entirely from memory. And these men built houses, not just large houses, not simply expensive houses. They built structures that were designed to make a statement so loud that it could be heard across an ocean. They hired architects who had trained in Paris and Rome, so they imported marble from Italy and limestone from France and oak paneling from manor houses in England that had been standing since the Tudor period. They brought over craftsmen, plasterers, fresco painters, wood carvers, mosaic artists, who had spent decades perfecting skills that were already considered almost extinct in their countries of origin. The results were staggering. The Breakers, built by Cornelius Vanderbilt II on the shores of Newport, Rhode Island, contained 70 rooms and required an army of servants to operate. Its Great Hall alone was over 40 feet high. Its construction cost in 1895 was approximately $7 million, a figure that translates, by some calculations, to nearly $300 million today. And it was not even considered the finest house the Vanderbilts had built. That distinction belonged to the original Vanderbilt mansion on Fifth Avenue in New York City, a monumental French Renaissance structure that occupied an entire city block and was demolished in 1926 to make room for a commercial building. That demolition should have been a warning. It wasn't. Because at exactly the moment those wealthy families were tearing down older palaces to build newer and larger ones, a set of historical forces was assembling that would, within a single generation, will make the great American private mansion not just economically difficult to maintain, but essentially impossible. The first was the federal income tax, introduced in 1913. For decades, the great industrialists had paid no income tax at all. The profits from their railroads and oil wells and steel mills flowed directly and entirely into their own pockets. The introduction of even a modest graduated income tax changed the mathematics of wealth accumulation in ways that no one initially appreciated. The second was the First World War, which decimated the European workforce of trained craftsmen and domestic servants. Before the war, a wealthy American family could import skilled labor from Europe at relatively modest cost. After the war, that labor was either dead or unavailable, or simply no longer interested in crossing an ocean to polish someone else's silver. The third was the Great Depression, which wiped out fortunes that had seemed absolutely indestructible. Banks failed. Businesses collapsed. The stock market, which had seemed to be a machine for the automatic generation of wealth, revealed itself to be something else entirely. Families that had been worth hundreds of millions of dollars in 1928 were worth, by 1932, a fraction of that. Some were worth nothing at all. And the fourth, the one that nobody could have predicted, was the simple reality that these houses cost an extraordinary amount of money to maintain. Not just to heat and light and staff, but to keep structurally sound. Roofs needed to be replaced. Foundations needed to be reinforced. The imported marble, it turned out, was not as durable in the American climate as everyone had assumed. The elaborate plasterwork required constant, skilled attention. The gardens, the formal gardens with their fountains and their topiary and their imported statuary, required armies of groundskeepers who needed to be paid and housed and fed. When the money started to disappear, the maintenance was the first thing to go. And once maintenance stopped, the clock started. Peter Widener was born in 1834 in Philadelphia, the son of a butcher. He left school at an early age to work in his brother's meat market, and by his mid-20s, he had identified an opportunity that would make him spectacularly wealthy. The Civil War had created an enormous demand for military provisions, and Widener secured a contract to supply mutton to the Union Army's Philadelphia garrison. The profits were substantial. He invested them in streetcars. Over the next 4 decades, Peter Widener assembled one of the greatest fortunes in American history. His streetcar networks eventually spread across multiple cities. He invested in steel and oil and banking. He became one of the largest individual shareholders in U.S. Steel. He was, by the early 20th century, one of the richest men in the world. And so he built a house. Now, Linwood Hall was completed in 1900 on a 300-acre estate in Elkins Park, a suburb north of Philadelphia. The architect was Horace Trumbauer, one of the most fashionable architects of the era, who designed the building in a neoclassical style modeled partly on English country houses and partly on French chateaux. The main house contained over 100 rooms. There was a private art gallery that held one of the most significant private collections of European paintings in the United States. Works by Raphael, El Greco, Rembrandt, Titian. There was a ballroom large enough to accommodate 400 guests. There was a library, a music room, a Roman-style swimming pool, and a garage that could house over 40 automobiles. The estate also contained a private greenhouse complex, a dairy farm, formal gardens designed after the French manner, and a casino building used for private entertainments, a carriage house, and separate housing for the dozens of servants required to operate the estate. Peter Widener died in 1915, having outlived one of his sons, George, who went down with the Titanic in 1912 along with his wife Eleanor. George's son Harry survived the sinking and went on to donate the Widener Library at Harvard in his parents' memory, one of the most significant memorial gifts in American educational history. The estate passed to Joseph Widener, Peter's surviving son, who continued to maintain it and to add to the art collection. Joseph was a significant figure in American art philanthropy, eventually donating the family's most important paintings to the National Gallery of Art in Washington. By the time of his death in 1943, Linwood Hall was already beginning to feel anachronistic, a house built for a world that no longer existed. What followed Joseph's death is a story that repeats, now with variations, across the history of almost every great American mansion. The heirs could not agree on what to do with it. The costs of maintenance were staggering. The art was gone, donated or sold. Without its collection, the house was essentially an empty shell. A magnificent empty shell, yes, with its marble floors and its elaborate plasterwork and its 40-foot ceilings, but still empty. The estate was subdivided. The outbuildings were demolished. The grounds were reduced from 300 acres to a fraction of that. Various proposals were floated over the decades. A college considered it. A hotel developer considered it. A religious organization acquired it at one point and occupied it, but was eventually unable to maintain it either. Today, Linwood Hall stands in what has become a middle-class suburban neighborhood, its neoclassical facade increasingly obscured by vegetation, its interior in an advanced state of decay. The marble floors are intact, but filthy. The plasterwork is still partly visible, but large sections have collapsed. The ballroom, which once held 400 people dancing beneath a painted ceiling, is accessible only to those willing to push through debris and risk falling through weakened floorboards. It is a house that cost approximately $8 million to build in 1900. It is now listed for sale at approximately a tenth of that, and there are no serious buyers. The iron gates still stand. Not every abandoned mansion has a story as dramatic as Linwood Hall. Many of them slipped away quietly over decades, in a process so gradual that no single person can quite account for how it happened. White Marsh Hall is another example from Pennsylvania, and it tells a slightly different version of the same story. Built between 1916 and 1921 for Edward Stotesbury, a Morgan banking partner who was, at the peak of his wealth, one of the richest men in the United States. White Marsh Hall was widely described at the time of its completion as the greatest private home in America. This was a significant claim in an era when significant private homes were not exactly rare, but it was not entirely without justification. The architect was again Horace Trumbauer, and the building was designed in a manner that deliberately evoked the great English country houses: Blenheim, Chatsworth, Castle Howard. The main block was flanked by two curved colonnaded wings. The entrance hall was roughly the size of a tennis court. There were formally arranged gardens on the south facade that stretched for hundreds of yards, a private theater, a bowling alley, squash courts, stabling for horses and automobiles, a private water tower, its own generating plant. Edward Stotesbury died in 1938. His widow Eva, who had been a famous beauty and an even more famous hostess, found herself in a position that was uncomfortable for a woman of her temperament and expectations. The fortune, it turned out, had been significantly diminished by a combination of the Depression and the late Mr. Stotesbury's financial decisions. The house was simply too large and too expensive to maintain. Eva Stotesbury moved to a smaller property and never returned to White Marsh Hall. She lived until 1946. By the time she died, the house had already been stripped of much of its contents, or its artwork, its furniture. After her death, the estate was sold and resold. Proposals were made and abandoned. A school considered it. A country club considered it. Various developers looked at it and calculated numbers that never quite added up. The demolition came in 1980. In a single decision, driven not by any dramatic crisis, but simply by the cold mathematics of carrying costs and tax obligations and the impossibility of finding anyone willing to take on a structure that needed millions of dollars of immediate repairs. White Marsh Hall was torn down. Bulldozers spent weeks working through a structure that had taken years to build. The marble was salvaged where possible. Some of the architectural details found their way into the collections of preservation societies. The rest became rubble. Today, there is a residential subdivision on the site. The streets have names like White Marsh Drive and Stotesbury Road, small gestures toward a history that most of the residents are only dimly aware of. The demolition of White Marsh Hall was not unusual. It was not even, by the standards of 20th century American architectural preservation, particularly notable. Hundreds of significant historic buildings were demolished in the same decades for similar reasons. The country was not, at that point, sufficiently awake to what it was losing. That awakening came slowly, and it came, in part, because of the people who began photographing what remained. The community of people who document abandoned buildings is larger than most people would guess. They call themselves urban explorers, or sometimes simply urbex. They range from casual photographers with smartphones who occasionally push open the door of a derelict factory, to serious, experienced practitioners who have spent decades carefully documenting structures that would otherwise disappear from history without record. The ones who document abandoned mansions occupy a specific and somewhat unusual position within this community, because the stakes are higher, because the history is richer, because the sense of loss is more acute, because you are not simply walking through the ruins of someone's workplace. You are walking through the ruins of someone's home, someone's vision of how life should be lived, someone's attempt to build something permanent in a world that has proven, repeatedly, that nothing is. Many of them have complicated feelings about what they do. There is an obvious thrill, the thrill of seeing something beautiful and forbidden and decaying that most people will never see. But there is also, fine for the serious ones, a genuine preservationist impulse. They photograph everything they can. They research the histories of the buildings. They contribute to databases and websites that catalog abandoned historic structures. They are, in a real sense, creating records that no one else is creating, because official preservation often comes too late, or not at all. The National Register of Historic Places is a federal program that documents buildings of architectural or historical significance. Being listed on the National Register is considered a meaningful recognition, but it doesn't by itself compel preservation. A privately owned building can be listed on the National Register and still be legally demolished by its owner. The listing does trigger certain review processes if federal permits or funding are involved, and it can make preservation tax credits available. But it is not, in the end, an ironclad protection. State and local historic preservation programs vary enormously. Some states have robust preservation laws. Others have essentially none. In states with weak preservation frameworks, a historically significant mansion can be demolished with minimal regulatory oversight. And so the documenting goes on. Weekend after weekend. Flash photographs in the dark. Careful notes. The smell of mildew and rot and collapsed plaster. The sound of pigeons in collapsed ceilings and water dripping through ruined roofs. The photographs that come out of these expeditions are frequently extraordinary. There is something about the combination of architectural grandeur and advanced decay that produces images of almost painful beauty. A marble staircase covered in leaves, a chandelier hanging from a ceiling that is half open to the sky, a bathtub full of fallen plaster, a library shelf still holding books that no one has touched in 40 years. These images circulate widely on social media, where they attract enormous attention from people who have never heard of urban exploration and have no particular interest in architectural history, but who find themselves unexpectedly moved by what they are seeing. There is something in these images that speaks to something deep, some recognition of the fragility of beautiful things, some meditation on impermanence, some understanding that the grand gestures we make against time are, in the end, not enough. In 1895, Frederick Vanderbilt, grandson of the original Commodore, and one of the less conspicuously extravagant members of a family not known for restraint, decided that what he needed was a house in Hyde Park, New York, on a bluff above the Hudson River. The location had been associated with prosperity and respectability for decades. The previous house on the site had been owned by a successful merchant. Before that, the land had been part of a substantial colonial-era estate. Frederick hired McKim, Mead and White, the most celebrated architectural firm in America, and asked for a Beaux-Arts mansion of appropriate scale. The result was a 54-room neoclassical structure completed in 1898 at a cost of approximately $2.5 million. It was, by Vanderbilt standards, relatively modest. His cousins had built houses twice as large. But it was finished to an extraordinary standard, with elaborate plasterwork and imported marble and furnishings that had been specifically commissioned from the leading craftsmen of the era. Frederick and his wife Louise used it as a spring and fall retreat. They had no children. They entertained occasionally, but were not, by the standards of their class, particularly social. The house was staffed year-round by a permanent household of servants, whose job it was to keep everything in perfect order for the roughly 2 months a year when the Vanderbilts were actually in residence. Frederick died in 1938. Louise had predeceased him. Their niece, who inherited the estate, found herself in possession of a magnificent house in which she had no particular interest and which cost a substantial amount of money to maintain. She donated it to the federal government the following year. Today, the Vanderbilt Mansion National Historic Site is administered by the National Park Service and is open to the public. It is one of the better preserved examples of Gilded Age domestic architecture in the United States, and it attracts a significant number of visitors each year, many of whom come away with a profound and somewhat disorienting sense of scale, of what it actually looked like to live at that level of material excess. But the Vanderbilt Mansion in Hyde Park was the exception. The lucky one. The one that found its way to an institution with the resources and the mandate to maintain it. Most of the others did not. The story of the American mansion in the 20th century is, at its core, a story about the relationship between private wealth and public good. These buildings were built entirely with private money, for private purposes, according to the private tastes of their owners. They owed nothing to the public and asked nothing of it. They were, in the most literal sense, private. But they were also, objectively, part of the cultural heritage of the country in which they were built. They employed thousands of craftsmen and artisans, whose skills are now effectively extinct. So they demonstrated what was architecturally possible at a particular moment in American history. They encoded, in their very proportions and materials and spatial arrangements, a particular vision of civilized life, a vision that we may not share, that we may find excessive or offensive or both, but that is nonetheless part of who we were. And when they are gone completely. There is no recovering what is lost when a great building is demolished or allowed to collapse. The photographs remain, the historical records remain, but the experience of the thing itself, of standing in that ballroom, of looking up at that ceiling, of feeling the scale and the weight and the peculiar hush of rooms built to impress, that is irreplaceable. And it is ending. Part of this is the particular American relationship with class. The great mansions are understood, at some level, as monuments to a system of inequality that Americans have always been somewhat uncomfortable acknowledging. They are the physical embodiment of the Gilded Age, of a period when a small number of people accumulated wealth on a scale that dwarfed the earnings of the workers whose labor had produced it. to preserve them, to spend public money on their maintenance, to celebrate them as national heritage. This feels, to many people, uncomfortably close to endorsing the system that produced them. This is not an unreasonable feeling, but it can lead to a kind of historical self-erasure, a willingness to let the evidence of our own past disappear because the past makes us uncomfortable. There is a house in Annandale-on-Hudson, New York, that most people pass without noticing, even when they drive directly by it. It is called Windcliff, and it is one of the most important abandoned buildings in the United States, for a reason that has nothing to do with its architecture, which is significant, but not extraordinary, and everything to do with a phrase that the woman who built it may or may not have coined. Windcliff was built in 1853 for Elizabeth Schermerhorn Jones, a wealthy New York socialite who was, by birth and marriage, connected to most of the significant families of the American upper class. Her niece was Edith Wharton, who would go on to become one of the greatest American novelists of the 20th century, and whose work explored with extraordinary precision the world her aunt and her parents inhabited. The house was designed in the Hudson Valley Gothic style, a romantic confection of pointed gables and irregular massing and deliberately picturesque detail. It sat on a high bluff above the Hudson River, with a view that, at the time of its construction, was considered one of the finest in the region. The phrase that is associated with Windcliff, though its exact origins are disputed, is keeping up with the Joneses. The idea being that Elizabeth Schermerhorn Jones and her Hudson Valley neighbors were so conspicuously wealthy, so aggressively competitive in their displays of consumption, that merely staying level with them required constant effort and expense. Whether or not Mrs. Jones herself coined the phrase, whether or not it was her neighbors who first used it to describe the exhausting social competition she represented, it entered the language, and it stayed there, long after Windcliff itself began to fall apart. Because Windcliff is now one of the most dramatically ruined houses in the United States. It has been unoccupied since the 1960s. Its roof has partially collapsed. Its interior is an extraordinary landscape of fallen plaster, collapsed ceilings, broken floors, and advancing vegetation. Trees are growing through the windows. The famous Hudson River view is still there. On clear days, you can still see it through the ruined walls. But the house itself is in the final stages of structural failure. Various owners have held the property over the decades since it was abandoned. Various plans have been proposed and abandoned. The Hudson River Valley is generally more alert to its architectural heritage than many parts of the country, and there have been advocates for Windcliff for decades. But the costs are enormous, and the complications of ownership, of legal status, of the sheer scale of the restoration required, have proven so far insurmountable. It is possible that the house that gave us the phrase, "keeping up with the Joneses," will be completely gone within a decade. It is possible that there will be nothing left but the foundation and the view. For every famous name, Vanderbilt, Widener, Stotesbury, there are dozens of others, less celebrated in their time and almost completely forgotten now, who built houses that are equally grand and equally abandoned. Consider the story of H. Rogers, one of the original Standard Oil partners, who built a summer estate in Southampton, Long Island, that contained over 40 rooms, formal gardens, a private pier, and a collection of outbuildings that rivaled a small village in its scope. Rogers died in 1909, and his estate went through several hands before eventually being demolished in the 1940s. The site is now occupied by a subdivision of post-war houses. Almost nothing remains. Or consider the extraordinary cluster of mansions that once lined Millionaire's Row in Cleveland, Ohio, Euclid Avenue, which in its late 19th century heyday was described by visitors from around the world as one of the most beautiful residential streets in America. The houses were extraordinary. John D., A Rockefeller lived on Euclid Avenue. So did Charles F. Brush, who invented the arc lamp. So did Marcus Hanna, who was one of the most powerful political figures of the 1890s. So did dozens of other men whose wealth had been generated by the extraordinary industrial growth of the Great Lakes region. Of the great mansions of Euclid Avenue, essentially none survive. The street was slowly commercialized over the first half of the 20th century. Houses were converted to offices, then to other uses, then abandoned, then demolished. The last significant mansion on Euclid Avenue was torn down in the 1970s. The street today bears no resemblance whatsoever to the great boulevard it once was. You could walk the length of it and not know that you were walking through what had been one of the most remarkable concentrations of private architectural wealth in the world. This is the quietly devastating reality of American architectural history. The great European countries have their castles and their manor houses and their chateaux, many of which have stood for 5 or 6 or 8 centuries. The United States, a younger country, yes, but not that young, has been dramatically less successful at preserving even the significant structures of its own past. The great period of American mansion building lasted roughly 60 years, from the 1870s to the 1930s. In another 60 years, it is possible that almost all physical evidence of it will be gone. Not all the stories end in loss. Some of them end in something more complicated, in partial preservation, in adaptive reuse, in the strange afterlives that buildings sometimes find when they are too large for any single purpose, but too significant to be simply discarded. The Breakers, Marble House, the Elms, the great Newport mansions survived through the extraordinary efforts of the Preservation Society of Newport County, which began acquiring them in the 1940s and 1950s at a time when they were considered expensive liabilities with no obvious future. The society turned them into museums, opened them to the public, and created an institution that has become one of the most significant architectural preservation organizations in the country. The Biltmore Estate in Asheville, North Carolina, the largest private house ever built in the United States, with 252 rooms, built by George Vanderbilt between 1889 and 1895, survived because the Vanderbilt family made the difficult decision to open it to the public in 1930, during the Great Depression, in an attempt to generate enough revenue to maintain the property. It is now one of the most visited historic homes in the country, attracting over 1 million visitors a year. The revenue from those visitors funds a continuous program of restoration and maintenance that has kept the house in excellent condition. But these are the exceptions. They are the ones that attracted enough attention, or enough institutional support, or enough committed advocates to survive. For every Biltmore, there are a dozen Whitemarsh halls, demolished without ceremony, their contents dispersed, their sites built over, their very existence known only to specialists and to the obsessive readers of architectural history. There is a community in Pennsylvania called Rosemont, just outside Philadelphia on the main line. And if you drive slowly enough and look at the right angle through certain gaps in the vegetation, you can catch glimpses of what appears to be an enormous ruined structure set back from the road. Most people who drive past it every day have never looked. Those who have looked have sometimes stopped and asked questions, and eventually learned the name: Carroll Cliff. It was built in the 1890s for a member of the Carroll family, one of the oldest and most distinguished Catholic families in Maryland, descendants of Charles Carroll of Carrollton, the only Catholic signer of the Declaration of Independence. The house was designed in a manner appropriate to its owner's sense of their own historical significance: massive, stone, Tudor revival in character, built on a scale that made it one of the larger private houses in Pennsylvania. It stood as a monument to a family whose name stretched back to the nation's founding, built to endure, edging day by day toward the silence that claimed it. The Carroll name in America is one of the oldest and most freighted with historical meaning that exists. Charles Carroll of Carrollton signed the Declaration of Independence in 1776. He was the last surviving signer when he died in 1832. And he was at that point one of the wealthiest men in the country, a Maryland landowner whose holdings ran to tens of thousands of acres, whose family had been in the colony since the 17th century, and whose fortune was built on the labor of enslaved people on his tobacco plantations. He was also, by all accounts, a man who understood that he was living at a hinge point of history, who grasped that what the founders were attempting was something that had not been attempted before, and who committed himself to it with a clarity and completeness that his descendants clearly took seriously. The house at Carroll Cliff was a physical expression of that inheritance. It was not simply a large house in a fashionable suburb. It was a statement about who these people were and where they came from and what they believed their place in American history to be. The stone walls and the Tudor revival details and the sheer scale of the thing were all saying the same thing. We have been here since the beginning, and we intend to remain. The irony of what has happened to Carroll Cliff, the decay, the abandonment, the slow erasure of everything that was meant to be permanent, is almost too pointed to bear. The family that produced the last surviving signer of the Declaration of Independence built a house that now cannot even maintain its own roof. The statement that was meant to last forever is barely legible anymore. This is what happens to statements, in the end. Even the most carefully carved ones. Carroll Cliff is not the only abandoned house with this kind of layered historical resonance. Across the United States, if you look carefully enough, the great abandoned mansions are connected to the major threads of American history in ways that make their deterioration feel like something more than simple architectural loss. They are losing the physical connective tissue that links the present to the past, and that loss is harder to quantify than the loss of square footage or ornamental plasterwork, but it is no less real. Consider what has happened to the great houses of Detroit. Detroit was, in the first decades of the 20th century, one of the wealthiest cities in the United States. The automotive industry had transformed a modest river town into an industrial behemoth, and the men who had made their fortunes in automobiles, and in the steel and rubber and glass and machinery that automobiles required, had built houses appropriate to their wealth. The neighborhoods of Indian Village and Boston Edison and Palmer Woods were lined with mansions of genuine architectural distinction, built by architects of national reputation for clients of national significance. Henry Ford lived in a house in Dearborn that was, by the standards of his contemporaries, relatively modest. He was famously indifferent to personal display. But the men around him, the suppliers and dealers and executives who had grown wealthy in his wake, were not similarly restrained. They built houses with ballrooms and libraries and conservatories and motor courts and formal gardens. Some of those houses are still standing and still inhabited. The neighborhoods of Indian Village and Boston Edison have gone through difficult periods. Decades of disinvestment, crime, and urban decay, but they have survived, and there has been in recent years a genuine revival of interest in them. People are moving back, houses are being restored. The architectural stock of early 20th century Detroit, which seemed for a while to be on the verge of complete obliteration, has proven more resilient than anyone would have predicted in 1990. But the story of Detroit's grandest house is a different one. So it is the story of the Whitney Mansion, a massive Romanesque revival structure built in 1894 for David Whitney Jr., a lumber baron who had made an extraordinary fortune in the pine forests of Michigan. The house had 52 rooms, a skylit picture gallery, a hydraulic elevator, one of the first private residential elevators in the country, and interiors finished to a standard of craftsmanship that reflected Whitney's determination to demonstrate that Detroit was a city of genuine cultural ambition, not merely a commercial outpost. Whitney died in 1900. His family occupied the house for several more decades. Then came the familiar sequence. The city changed around the house. The neighborhood changed. The economics of maintaining a 52-room mansion in an increasingly industrial urban context became untenable. The house was eventually abandoned, and it stood empty for years, its extraordinary interiors deteriorating behind its massive stone walls. The Whitney mansion survived, but only barely, and only because a restaurateur acquired it in the 1980s and undertook an extensive restoration that transformed it into one of the finest restaurants in Detroit. Today, the Whitney restaurant operates in the mansion, and diners eat in rooms that have been restored to something approaching their original condition. The hydraulic elevator still works. The picture gallery is still intact. The craftsmanship that David Whitney paid so much for in 1894 is visible once more. This is one model for the survival of these buildings. Not a museum, not a public institution, a restaurant, a business that generates enough revenue to justify the extraordinary cost of maintenance. It is an imperfect model. The public access is conditional on the willingness and ability to pay for a meal, which means that the building is technically open, but not genuinely democratic. But it is better than the alternative, which is what happened to the Whitney's peers up and down the street. There are very few Whitneys. Most of the great houses of Detroit did not find their restaurateur. Most of them are gone. The question of what to do with these buildings, the practical, real-world question of how to fund their maintenance and find uses for them that are economically sustainable, is one that preservation advocates have been wrestling with for decades without finding a fully satisfactory answer. The traditional model is the house museum, the property acquired by a historical society or preservation organization, open to the public as a museum, supported by admission fees and membership dues and donations, and sometimes government grants. This model works for the most significant properties, the ones with strong name recognition, compelling stories, and broad public appeal. The Biltmore works as a house museum. The Newport mansions work as house museums. Monticello works as a house museum. But it doesn't work for everything. House museums are notoriously difficult to operate sustainably. The costs of maintaining a large historic structure are enormous and never go away. Admission revenue is typically insufficient to cover operating costs, let alone capital improvements. Membership programs help, but rarely solve the underlying problem. Government grants are uncertain and increasingly competitive. The result is that many small and medium-sized house museums operate in a state of permanent financial precarity, unable to invest in the maintenance they need, slowly watching the properties they are supposed to be preserving deteriorate. The alternative models, adaptive reuse, conversion to apartments, or offices, or hotels, or restaurants, all involve compromises. They require changes to the historic fabric of the building that purists find uncomfortable. They typically require the removal or alteration of historically significant elements in order to meet modern building codes or to accommodate the practical requirements of the new use. A mansion converted to apartments will have its original room configurations disrupted. A mansion converted to offices will have its original decorative elements covered or removed. A mansion converted to a hotel will have its original plumbing and electrical systems replaced. These are real losses, but they are, preservationists have increasingly come to accept, preferable to the alternative. A mansion that has been converted to apartments and lost some of its original room configurations is still standing. A mansion that has been left empty and unmaintained for 40 years is rubble. This shift in thinking from preservation as the maintenance of an ideal, original, uncompromised historical artifact to preservation as the pragmatic accommodation of living buildings to changing circumstances, has been one of the most significant developments in American preservation practice over the last half-century. It has saved buildings that would otherwise have been lost. But it has also required a willingness to accept imperfection, to acknowledge that the perfect is often the enemy of the good, that a partially altered historic building is worth more than a completely destroyed one. Not everyone in the preservation community has been comfortable with this shift. There are still purists who argue that adaptive reuse is a form of destruction, that converting a mansion to apartments is fundamentally no different from demolishing it, because the thing that made it significant is gone. These arguments are not entirely without merit. There is a real difference between a house that has been preserved as it was and a house that has been adapted to new uses. The experience of visiting a house museum, of seeing the rooms as they were, of understanding the spatial logic of a historic way of life, is categorically different from the experience of living in an apartment that was once a library or a ballroom. But buildings do not exist in amber. They exist in time. And time, as these stories make endlessly clear, is not kind to buildings that no one is maintaining. There is a road in Newport, Rhode Island, called Bellevue Avenue, and if you drive along it on a summer afternoon, you will pass mansion after mansion after mansion, the surviving ones, the lucky ones, the ones that found their house museums and their historic preservation societies and their endowments. You will pass the Breakers and Marble House and Chateau-sur-Mer and the Elms and Rosecliff and Bellecourt, and a dozen others, all of them gleaming in the summer sun, their lawns immaculate, their facades recently repointed, their interiors open to the public for a fee that helps, however inadequately, to maintain them. And if you look carefully at certain points along Bellevue Avenue, you will notice gaps, places where the Great Wall of Mansions is interrupted by something smaller, something newer, something that does not fit. These are the sites of the mansions that were demolished, the ones that did not survive, the ones whose stories ended in the same way as White Marsh Hall and 100 other places. The gaps are not labeled. There are no plaques explaining what stood there. You have to know the history to see the absences. The absences are everywhere once you start looking for them. In Newport alone, dozens of significant Gilded Age mansions have been demolished. Some were torn down in the 1940s and 1950s, when the costs of maintaining them had become truly impossible, and there was not yet a preservation infrastructure to absorb them. Some were torn down later, in the 1960s and 1970s, and are victims of changing tastes and the broad cultural indifference to Victorian and Edwardian architecture that characterized those decades. A few have been demolished in recent years, as preservation battles were lost and economics triumphed. The mansions that survived in Newport survived because of a particular combination of circumstances that did not exist in most other places. There was a strong local preservation advocacy. There was a cultural identity tied to the historic buildings. Newport understood itself as a historic place in a way that, say, suburban Philadelphia did not. There was an existing tourist infrastructure that could absorb the costs of house museums, and there were individuals of means and commitment who were willing to donate time and money and political capital to the fight. These circumstances are not replicable everywhere. They were not replicable in Cleveland, where Euclid Avenue was lost. They were not replicable in Detroit, where most of the great houses are gone. They were not replicable in the dozens of smaller cities and suburbs across the country, where significant mansions have disappeared without any preservation battle at all, simply because no one knew enough to fight. This is one of the reasons why the work of the urban explorers and the documentary photographers matters so much, or even when, perhaps especially when, it is too late to save the building they are photographing, because they are creating a record, They are saying, this was here, this existed, this is what it looked like before it was gone. And that record, however inadequate as a substitute for the thing itself, is better than nothing. It is the difference between a building that disappears completely, leaving no trace, and a building that disappears but leaves behind evidence of what it was. The photographers who have documented Linwood Hall have created an extraordinary visual archive of a house that most Americans will never see, and that may not survive another decade. Their photographs show the marble floors and the collapsed ceilings, and the extraordinary light that enters through the tall windows in the late afternoon. They show the details that no written description could fully convey. The particular quality of the plasterwork, the scale of the rooms, the persistence of beauty in the midst of destruction. These photographs are not a substitute for the house, but they are something. Augusta, Georgia is not a city that most people associate with the grand tradition of the American country house. But the American South has its own chapter in the story of the abandoned mansion, and it is one that touches on something that the Pennsylvania and New York stories only brush against: the particular relationship between the great houses of the South and the history of slavery and racial injustice that funded so many of them. The great plantations of the antebellum South, the houses that appear in romanticized form in countless films and novels, the white-columned Greek revival structures set in fields of cotton or tobacco, were not simply houses. They were the headquarters of agricultural enterprises that depended entirely on enslaved labor. The wealth that built them, the wealth that paid for the imported marble and the ornamental ironwork and the formal gardens, was extracted from human beings who had been denied every right and every freedom. This history is inseparable from the buildings themselves. You cannot stand in the parlor of a great antebellum plantation house without standing in a space that was furnished and maintained and kept functioning by enslaved people. You cannot admire the architecture without acknowledging that the architecture was made possible by a system of brutal exploitation. And you cannot think about what it means to preserve these buildings without confronting the question of what exactly you are preserving and for whom and why. These questions have become more pressing in recent years as the country has engaged in a broader reckoning with its history of racial injustice. Some plantation sites have responded by fundamentally reorienting their interpretive approach, by shifting the focus of their museum programs from the lives of the white owners to the lives of the enslaved workers, by acknowledging the violence and exploitation that the beautiful buildings represent, by making the full history visible rather than the partial, comfortable version. Others have resisted this reorientation. The debates are genuine and ongoing, and they intersect in complicated ways with the question of preservation itself. Because the argument for preserving these structures is, at some level, an argument for preserving evidence of a history that many people, understandably, justifiably, would prefer not to celebrate. But erasure is not the same as reckoning. A plantation house that is demolished does not become less implicated in slavery. It simply removes one piece of physical evidence from a history that needs to be confronted, not avoided. The question of what to do with these buildings, how to preserve them, how to interpret them, how to use them as tools for honest historical understanding rather than as props for nostalgia, is one of the most complicated in American preservation, and it will not be resolved quickly or easily. On what is clear is that the buildings themselves are indifferent to these debates. They decay at the same rate, whether they are being argued over or ignored. The roof that needs replacing does not wait for the scholars and the advocates and the community organizations to reach consensus. Time moves at its own pace, and it has no interest in the subtleties of public memory. Somewhere in Louisiana, right now, there is a plantation house whose roof has been leaking for 20 years. The attic floors are rotted. The ceiling plaster in the main rooms has been falling in great chunks, exposing the lath and the structural timber beneath. The formal gardens are jungle now. The outbuildings where enslaved people lived are collapsed. The house itself is standing, but only just. And every year that passes without intervention makes the next year's intervention more expensive and more difficult. No one has intervened. The ownership is disputed. The costs are prohibitive. The history is contested. The house stands. Pittsburgh is an interesting case because it was, in some respects, ground zero for Gilded Age wealth. The steel industry that made Carnegie and Frick and Mellon and dozens of lesser-known men extraordinarily rich was centered there, and the houses they built in the neighborhoods of Shadyside and Squirrel Hill and Point Breeze were genuinely remarkable. Some have survived. The Frick Mansion, Clayton, is now a museum, beautifully maintained, and it offers a rare opportunity to see what the interior of a great Gilded Age house actually looked like when it was functioning. The detail and the quality of the surviving contents are extraordinary. But Clayton is surrounded by the ghosts of houses that are gone. Point Breeze, where Clayton sits, was once lined with mansions of comparable scale and quality. They are almost all gone now, demolished over the course of a century, their sites redeveloped as smaller residential properties or commercial uses. The neighborhood retains its pleasant character, but the architectural context in which Clayton was built has been almost entirely erased. The Frick House now sits in isolation, a surviving fragment of a world that used to surround it on all sides. Carnegie himself, the man who, more than any other, embodied the contradictions of Gilded Age wealth, who built an empire on the labor of workers he paid as little as possible, and then gave almost all of his fortune away to libraries and concert halls and universities, sold his Pittsburgh mansion in 1897, and moved permanently to New York. His Pittsburgh house is gone. The site is now occupied by other uses. The man who funded the construction of nearly 3,000 public libraries across the English-speaking world did not arrange for the preservation of his own house. He did not, apparently, consider it worth preserving. He was too focused on what he was building to worry much about what he was leaving behind. This is, in retrospect, a telling detail. Carnegie understood that libraries were worth preserving. He understood that music was worth preserving, that scientific knowledge was worth preserving, that the educational infrastructure of a democratic society was worth preserving. He did not understand, or did not care, that his own house, the physical evidence of how he had lived, the context in which his extraordinary career had unfolded, was also worth preserving. He was not unusual in this. The Gilded Age plutocrats were, in general, remarkably unsentimental about their own houses. They built them with extraordinary care and expense, maintained them at great cost, and then discarded them with relatively little apparent regret when the economics of doing so changed. The houses were instruments, not heirlooms. They were demonstrations of wealth and taste, not family seats in the European sense. When the demonstration no longer served its purpose, the instrument was set aside. The European aristocracy's deep attachment to their ancestral seats, the willingness to live in genteel poverty in a drafty castle rather than sell it, was not a characteristic of the American plutocracy. The Americans were too new, too mobile, or too committed to the idea that the future was always going to be better than the past, to feel the weight of ancestral obligation that kept European families in their houses long after the economics made any rational sense. This cultural difference goes a long way toward explaining why the United States has lost so much more of its significant domestic architecture than Britain or France. It is not simply a matter of preservation law, though the law matters. It is a matter of how wealth relates to history. The British aristocrat in his crumbling castle is making a statement about identity and continuity and the importance of the past. The American industrialist who sells his mansion and moves to a hotel suite is making a different statement about freedom, about mobility, about the refusal to be defined by what you once had. Both statements are, in their way, comprehensible, but only one of them tends to preserve buildings. The people who fight against this, the preservation advocates, the local historical societies, the state historic preservation officers, the private individuals who devote years of their lives to saving single buildings, are fighting against an economic logic that is, in purely financial terms, almost impossible to defeat. The numbers simply do not work. They have never worked. They will not work without subsidies of some kind. Tax credits, grants, low-interest loans, donations, that change the underlying economics enough to make preservation competitive with demolition. In the United States, those subsidies exist, but are insufficient. The Federal Historic Tax Credit Program, which provides a 20% tax credit for certified historic rehabilitations, has been one of the most effective preservation tools in the country, enabling the rehabilitation of tens of thousands of historic buildings over the past 4 decades. But it is available only for income-producing properties, commercial buildings, rental housing, not for private residences. The great private mansions, which are by definition residential, do not qualify. Some states have state-level historic tax credit programs that cover a broader range of property types, including residential. But these programs vary enormously in their generosity and their effectiveness, and they are perennially at risk of being reduced or eliminated when state budgets come under pressure. The result is a patchwork system that saves some buildings and loses others, that works reasonably well in some states and almost not at all in others, that is adequate to prevent the most egregious losses in the most well-organized preservation communities, but that is entirely inadequate to the scale of what is being lost across the country as a whole. And more will always be lost.